Welcome, beloved listener, to the Goodnight Gospel, a place where we let Scripture wash over us like gentle waves, bringing peace to restless hearts and courage to weary souls. Tonight, we step into one of the most well-known yet endlessly deep stories in the Bible, the story of David and Goliath. For centuries, this account has stirred courage in children, inspired warriors, and encouraged the brokenhearted. But it is not just a tale of a boy and a giant. It is about fear and faith, about armies and shepherds, about weakness and strength. Most of all, it is about the God who delivers his people, not by sword or spear, but by his own mighty hand. So I invite you, settle into a place of rest. Let your shoulders relax. Let your breath slow down. Imagine yourself under the starlit sky of the ancient Near East, hearing the distant murmur of soldiers in their camps, feeling the tension of two nations standing on the edge of war. And with every detail, let your spirit rest in the truth that the same God who was with David is with you now. The Bible says in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 1 through 3, "Now the Philistines gathered together their armies to battle, and they were gathered together at Soko, which belongs to Judah, and encamped between Soko and Azekah in Ephes Dammim. Saul and the men of Israel were gathered together, and encamped in the valley of Elah, and set the battle in array against the Philistines. The Philistines stood on the mountain on the one side, and Israel stood on the mountain on the other side, and there was a valley between them." This simple description sets the stage, but if we slow down, we begin to see it come alive. The valley of Elah lies about 15 miles southwest of Bethlehem, in the rolling foothills of Judah. It is a wide valley, shaped like a shallow bowl, with ridges that rise gently on either side. In the springtime, the fields would be green with barley and wheat, but by the time armies marched through, the stalks would be trampled, the ground scarred by footsteps, the air heavy with dust. A dry stream bed runs through the valley floor. Its stones, smoothed by centuries of water, still lie scattered across the ground. It was from this brook that David would one day pick up 5 smooth stones. But for now, the stream bed marked the line between two armies. The no man's land, where death waited for anyone who dared step too far. On the western ridge, the Philistines had pitched their tents. On the eastern ridge, Israel's camp stretched across the slopes. Between them lay emptiness, the tension of silence waiting to be broken. The Philistines were not strangers to Israel. They were seafaring people, descended from those who had migrated from the Aegean region centuries earlier. They were skilled in ironwork, giving them superior weapons compared to Israel's bronze. They were organized, disciplined, and confident. Their tents in the valley of Elah would have been lined in order, soldiers sharpening spears, shield bearers polishing iron. Fires burned with the smell of roasting meat. The sound of laughter and bold voices carried on the wind, for the Philistines were not afraid. They believed victory was theirs. On the opposite ridge, Israel's camp was less confident. King Saul, once bold, was now weighed down by fear and insecurity. The men under his command looked across the valley and saw not just an enemy, but an overwhelming threat. Their armor was less advanced, their hearts less steady. The silence in their camp was heavy, broken by whispered doubts, the nervous clinking of swords against shields, and the anxious prayers of men who wondered if they would live to see another sunrise. Fathers thought of their families. Sons wondered if they would return home. Even the bravest soldier could feel the tremor of fear in his chest. Picture the two armies, tens of thousands of men, staring at one another across that valley. Days passed with no advance. Each side waited for the other to make the first move, knowing the first step into the valley could mean slaughter. The valley itself became a symbol. It was the space of decision, the place where fear and faith would collide, where God's plan would break into history. Pause here. The Valley of Elah was not just a location in history. It was a picture of the valleys we face today. Between the ridges of comfort and safety lies the valley of decision. It is in these valleys that our giants appear, taunting us, daring us to step forward. But just as God was already preparing David for this valley, so he prepares us for ours. Take a slow, deep breath. Inhale trust. Exhale anxiety. Whisper, Lord, when I stand in my valley, remind me you are near. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 4, we are told, a champion out of the camp of the Philistines named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span, went out. From the Philistine camp, a figure began to move. At first, he was just another soldier stepping into the valley. But as he drew closer, the scale of his size became undeniable. He was massive, towering above every man on the field. Goliath of Gath, their champion, a giant whose reputation stretched far beyond this valley. 6 cubits and a span, nearly 10 feet tall. Imagine standing before a man who could look over your head as easily as you look over a child. His shoulders were broad, his stride heavy, each step sinking deep into the dusty earth. His arms bulged with the strength of years of training and war. Even his shadow seemed to swallow the ground. The soldiers of Israel, lined along their ridge, squinted into the valley. Some muttered prayers under their breath, others froze, unable to believe what they were seeing. This was not a man you could simply face in combat. He looked less like flesh and more like a force of nature. Verse 5 describes him. He had a helmet of bronze on his head, and he wore a coat of mail, and the weight of the coat was 5,000 shekels of bronze. That coat of mail, scaled armor resembling overlapping plates like the hide of a serpent, weighed about 125 pounds. Imagine carrying another man's body weight on your own frame just as armor, and yet moving with ease. His helmet gleamed in the sun, a dome of bronze protecting his skull. His shins were covered in bronze greaves. Across his back was strapped a javelin, not of wood alone, but tipped and reinforced with bronze. Verse 7 continues. The staff of his spear was like a weaver's beam, and his spear's head weighed 600 shekels of iron. His shield bearer went before him. The shaft of his spear was so thick, it could be mistaken for a beam of wood used in construction. The iron tip alone weighed 15 pounds, the weight of a bowling ball. This was not just a weapon, it was a declaration. Each part of his equipment screamed intimidation, and before him marched his shield bearer, carrying a shield so large it was like a moving wall of protection. To Israel's soldiers, this was not just a man, he was a fortress on legs. Then, from beneath his helmet, a voice bellowed across the valley. Verse 8 says, He stood and cried out to the armies of Israel and said to them, Why have you come out to line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and you servants to Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. His words echoed off the rocky slopes. soldiers on Israel's ridge stiffened. His tone was mocking, dripping with contempt. He was not merely challenging their strength, he was insulting their identity. "You are servants of Saul," he sneered, reducing them to followers of a trembling king rather than servants of the living God. He continued in verses 9 and 10. "If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us. I defy the armies of Israel this day. Give me a man, that we may fight together." This was psychological warfare. One man, one duel, winner takes all. It spared armies the bloodshed of full battle, but it placed unbearable pressure on Israel. Who among them could face such a giant? His words carried across the valley morning and evening. 40 days he taunted them. At dawn, as the mist rose from the valley floor, his voice cut through the silence. At dusk, as campfires flickered on the ridges, he roared again, his challenge shaking the hearts of men. Verse 11 tells us plainly, "When Saul and all Israel heard these words of the Philistine, they were dismayed and greatly afraid." Think of Saul, the tallest man in Israel, once anointed king, once filled with courage. He had led Israel to victories before, but now he sat in his tent, silent, weighed down by fear. His soldiers looked to him for leadership, but he offered none. Around the camp, men whispered. Some avoided looking across the valley, ashamed of their fear. Others stared, paralyzed, their hands trembling on their swords. No one dared to step forward. For 40 days, no one moved. The Philistines grew bolder with each sunrise. Their laughter carried across the valley. Their confidence swelled, while Israel's hope shrank. Before David ever stood in the valley of Elah, before his sling ever struck a stone, God had already chosen him. In 1 Samuel chapter 16 verse 1 we hear, "Yahweh said to Samuel, 'How long will you mourn for Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided a king for myself among his sons.'" The Lord's eyes had already fallen on a boy in Bethlehem, a boy no one else thought of, a boy his father had not even considered worthy of invitation. God saw what man could not see. Samuel obeyed. He traveled to Bethlehem, to the house of Jesse. The elders of the town trembled when they saw him, afraid that his arrival meant judgment. But Samuel reassured them that he had come in peace, to sacrifice to the Lord. Jesse began to present his sons. Eliab came first, tall, strong, a man who looked like a leader. Samuel thought, "Surely this is the Lord's anointed." But in 1 Samuel chapter 16 verse 7, God corrected him. "Don't look on his face or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For Yahweh doesn't see as man sees, for man looks at the outward appearance, but Yahweh looks at the heart." One by one, 7 sons passed before Samuel. Each time the Lord said, "Not this one." Confusion must have flickered across Samuel's face. Finally he asked, "Are these all your sons?" Jesse hesitated, almost as though embarrassed. "There remains the youngest," he admitted, "but he is out keeping the sheep." David was summoned from the fields. Imagine him arriving, his clothes smelling of pasture, his hair tousled by the wind, his hands rough from the staff, his skin bronzed by the sun. The Bible describes him as ruddy, with bright eyes and handsome appearance. But what stood out most was his heart. the Lord said to Samuel, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." Samuel poured oil on David's head in the presence of his brothers. And in verse 13, we read, "The Spirit of Yahweh came mightily on David from that day forward." It was a secret anointing, known only to Samuel and David's family. Outwardly, nothing had changed. David returned to the sheep. But inwardly, everything was different. The Spirit of God rested upon him, shaping his heart, strengthening his courage, preparing him for the day when the valley would call his name. David's training ground was not a palace, but pastures. His companions were not soldiers, but sheep. Yet it was here that God was forging his character. When a lion or bear came to seize a lamb, David did not run. He pursued the beast, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its jaws. If the predator turned on him, he seized it by its beard and killed it. These battles, fought far from human eyes, prepared him for the battle everyone would one day see. At night, beneath the stars, David played his harp. His fingers strummed melodies of worship. His voice rose in songs that would later become psalms, prayers of trust, laments of sorrow, declarations of God's greatness. Alone in the fields, David learned to worship with his whole heart. He was learning that victory does not come from sword or spear, but from the Lord. Word of David's skill reached beyond the fields. Saul, tormented by an evil spirit, sought relief in music. One of his servants said, "I have seen a son of Jesse who is skillful in playing, a mighty man of valor, prudent in speech, and the Lord is with him." David was summoned. He stood before Saul, harp in hand, still just a boy, and played. The music soothed the troubled king. The shadows in Saul's mind lifted, and Saul loved him, making him his armor-bearer, keeping him close at hand. Without knowing it, Saul had welcomed his replacement into his court. The shepherd who played melodies of worship would one day inherit the throne. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 12 through 14, the Bible says that Jesse, now an old man, had 8 sons. The 3 oldest, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, were already serving in Saul's army. But David, the youngest, went back and forth between Saul's court and his father's fields, caring for the sheep. It was a humble life. He carried bread and cheese to his brothers at the battlefield. He was overlooked by men, but chosen by God. Now the stage is set. On one ridge, Goliath thunders his challenge. On the other, Israel trembles in fear. And in Bethlehem, Jesse will soon send his youngest son with bread and cheese for his brothers. A simple errand that will place him face to face with a giant. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 17, we read, "Jesse said to David his son, 'Now take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves, and carry them quickly to the camp to your brothers. And bring these 10 cheeses to the captain of their 1,000, and see how your brothers are doing, and bring back news of them.'" It was a simple task. Jesse, too old to join the army, longed for word of his 3 eldest sons, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shammah, who had marched to battle with Saul. Like any father, he worried for them. So he entrusted David, the youngest, with a mission of care. Bread for his brothers, cheese for their commander, and most importantly, news for a father's anxious heart. David, though already anointed for kingship, was still a son, still obedient, still faithful in small things. He rose early in the morning, left the sheep with a keeper, and set out with provisions on his back. Picture David walking the rugged road from Bethlehem to the valley of Elah. The path wound through rocky hills, past vineyards and olive groves, over dusty ridges where the morning sun cast long shadows. As he walked, he may have passed travelers whispering of the war. Merchants with carts gave updates. The Philistines are camped in Judah. The armies have faced each other for weeks. Rumors spread like wildfire. They say their champion is a giant, but David pressed on, his steps steady, provisions secure. His heart, already shaped in the solitude of the fields, did not tremble. He had faced lions. He had faced bears. He had learned to trust the Lord. What were men compared to God? The journey was not long in distance, but it bridged two worlds, from the quiet pastures of Bethlehem to the tense battlefield where fear ruled Israel's camp. When David arrived, the scene unfolded before him. The valley of Elah stretched wide, flanked by Israel's ridge on one side and the Philistines on the other. Soldiers gathered in ranks, armor clattering as they moved into formation. Shouts of commanders rose and fell like waves. It was just as the Bible describes in verse 20. The army was going out to the fight line, and they shouted for the battle. But their shouts lacked conviction. They were the cries of men trying to muster courage they did not feel. The Philistines, by contrast, shouted with confidence. Their laughter rolled like thunder across the valley. And then, as if on cue, the booming voice of Goliath cut through the air once again. His words of defiance rang out, mocking Israel, challenging them to send a man. David stopped, his young eyes narrowing as he listened. Verse 23 says, "Behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came out of the armies of the Philistines and spoke according to the same words. And David heard them. For 40 days, Israel had listened. For 40 days, they had cowered. But this was the first time David heard the challenge. And unlike the soldiers around him, he did not tremble. His heart burned with indignation. Verse 24 tells us, all the men of Israel, when they saw the man, fled from him and were terrified. Picture it, seasoned warriors shrinking back, shields trembling in their hands, faces pale. And in their midst stood David, a shepherd boy, watching not with fear, but with faith. He turned to those near him and asked in verse 26, "What shall be done to the man who kills this Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" To David, this was not a matter of size or strength. It was a matter of honor. Goliath was mocking not just Israel, but the living God, and that was unacceptable. But not everyone saw David's faith as courage. His eldest brother, Eliab, overheard him. Verse 28 tells us, Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your pride and the naughtiness of your heart, for you have come down that you might see the battle." Eliab's words cut sharp. Perhaps he felt ashamed that his younger brother spoke boldly while he himself trembled. Perhaps jealousy stirred. After all, Samuel had passed over him and anointed David. Whatever the reason, his pride lashed out. He belittled David, those few sheep. He accused him of pride. He dismissed him as a boy seeking entertainment. But David replied in verse 29, "What have I now done? Is there not a cause?" His words revealed his heart. He was not there for pride, not for curiosity, but because there was a cause worth fighting for, the honor of God's name. David's words began to spread through the camp. Soldiers repeated them. His questions stirred conversation. Eventually, word reached Saul. A messenger came. There is a young man asking what will be done for the one who defeats Goliath. Saul, desperate for hope, summoned him. The stage was being set for a meeting between a trembling king and a fearless shepherd. Pause here. David's brothers saw arrogance. The soldiers saw naivety, but God saw faith. What others dismiss in you, your youth, your simplicity, your confidence in God, may be the very thing he uses to bring victory. Eliab belittled David, but David refused to be silenced. He knew there was a cause worth standing for, and he would not back down. Take a breath. Inhale confidence in God. Exhale fear of people's opinions. Whisper, Lord, give me courage to stand, even when others misunderstand me. The boy who carried bread and cheese had now carried a question that pierced Israel's fear. Soon he would stand before Saul. Soon he would face the giant himself. The moment of destiny was drawing near. Word of David's bold words reached the tent of King Saul. The whispers traveled quickly through the camp. There is a youth who asks why this Philistine is allowed to defy the armies of the living God. Saul, worn and weary, sat in his command tent. His shoulders slumped, his eyes heavy with sleeplessness. For 40 days, he had heard Goliath's challenge, and for 40 days, he had offered no answer. His heart, once full of courage, had grown faint, but the mention of someone speaking differently, someone questioning the fear that had overtaken Israel, stirred his curiosity. Bring him to me, Saul ordered. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 32, we read, David said to Saul, "Let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with this Philistine." Imagine the scene. A boy, not yet fully grown, standing before a king dressed in armor. David's hands still smelled faintly of sheep and pasture. His tunic was plain, his frame lean from days in the sun, yet his eyes shone with faith. "Let no man's heart fail," he said boldly. While Saul's seasoned warriors trembled, David spoke of courage. His words carried weight, not because of his age or experience, but because they carried conviction. Saul blinked, perhaps at first in disbelief. Verse 33 says, Saul said to David, "You are not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him, for you are but a youth, and he a man of war from his youth." Saul saw only what was on the outside. David was young, inexperienced in war, without armor or training. Goliath was seasoned, towering, undefeated. To Saul, the comparison was absurd, but David did not back down. Instead, he offered his testimony of God's faithfulness. In verses 34 to 36, David said to Saul, "Your servant kept his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and took a lamb out of the flock, I went out after him, struck him, and delivered it out of his mouth. When he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, struck him, and killed him. Your servant struck both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine shall be as one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God." Pause and picture it. Alone in the hills, David had faced predators that threatened his flock. A lion with golden mane glinting in the sun, its roar shaking the ground. A bear, massive and relentless, its claws tearing at the earth. Any shepherd would have fled, but David did not. He chased, he struck, he seized, he killed. And why? Because the sheep were entrusted to his care, because he trusted in the Lord. These hidden victories, unseen by crowds, were training for the battle to come. In the solitude of the fields, God had been preparing David's courage, faith, and skill. Then David added in verse 37, "Yahweh who delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine." Something stirred in Saul. He saw in David's eyes what he no longer carried in his own: faith. He recognized a conviction that could not be shaken. Though reason said no, hope whispered yes. So in verse 37, Saul said to David, "Go. Yahweh will be with you." It was both a release and an admission. Saul could not fight this battle. But maybe, just maybe, God would fight it through this shepherd boy. David stood ready. Saul, persuaded, would soon clothe him in armor that did not fit, armor he would lay aside. For David would not win with man's weapons, but with the simple tools of a shepherd and the mighty power of God. After granting David permission to fight, Saul felt a strange sense of duty. If this boy was to represent Israel, he should at least look like a warrior. Perhaps Saul thought he could give David some advantage. Perhaps he thought clothing him in royal armor would ease his own guilt. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 38, we read, "Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a bronze helmet on his head, and he clad him with a coat of mail. David strapped his sword on his armor, and he tried to walk, for he had not tested it." Imagine the scene. Saul's attendants lifting the heavy coat of mail and lowering it onto David's shoulders. The bronze helmet wobbling on his youthful head, slipping down toward his brow. The sword hanging awkwardly at his side, its weight pulling him down. David, still slender from the fields, staggered beneath it all. The soldiers watching must have exchanged glances. Some may have chuckled. Others shook their heads in disbelief. Here was their champion, a boy drowning in borrowed armor? David took a few steps, the clink of the armor sounding foreign. He shook his head. In verse 39, he said to Saul, "I can't go with these, for I have not tested them." Gently, he removed the helmet. He unstrapped the sword. He shrugged off the heavy mail. One by one, he laid them aside. The pile of armor clattered on the ground, a picture of man's strength abandoned in favor of God's. David knew he could not fight with what did not belong to him. He could not wear another man's confidence. He could not wield another man's sword. He had to face Goliath with what he knew, with what God had trained him to use, with the tools of a shepherd. Verse 40 tells us, "He took his staff in his hand, chose for himself 5 smooth stones out of the brook, and put them in the shepherd's bag, which he had, even in his wallet. His sling was in his hand, and he came near to the Philistine." David's weapon was simple, a sling, 2 cords with a leather pouch in the middle. To many it looked like a child's toy, but in skilled hands, a sling was deadly. Shepherds practiced for hours, slinging stones to scare predators away from their flocks. David had spent years perfecting his aim. He knew how to send a stone flying with speed and precision, and now this simple weapon would be enough. Picture David descending into the valley. The air tense, eyes watching from both ridges. He approached the dry stream bed that cut across the valley floor. Kneeling, he ran his hands through the stones, smooth, rounded, weathered by years of water. He chose 5. Why 5? Perhaps as preparation, perhaps in wisdom, though one would be enough. He slipped them into his shepherd's bag, the familiar leather pouch worn at his side. Each stone represented not his own strength, but trust in God's provision. As he rose, dust clung to his knees. His sling rested in his hand, ready. The giant still roared across the valley, but David's heart was steady. The picture was striking. On one ridge stood Goliath, armored head to toe, spear gleaming, shield bearer before him, voice like thunder. On the other walked David, no armor, no sword, only a sling, a staff, and 5 stones hidden in a bag. But what the eye could not see was greater. David was clothed in the Spirit of the Lord. That invisible covering was stronger than bronze, sharper than iron, more certain than any spear. The shepherd boy was now ready. He carried no sword, no shield, no armor. Yet he carried something far greater, faith in the living God. Step by step, he began to walk toward the giant who had terrorized Israel for 40 days. The moment of confrontation had come. The valley grew still as David began to walk forward. Every eye turned to him. From Israel's ridge, soldiers leaned forward, squinting at the sight. Some gasped. Others whispered, "Is Saul mad? Has he truly sent a boy?" On the Philistine side, laughter rippled through the ranks. "A shepherd with a stick and a sling," they mocked. Their laughter grew louder as David descended, his steps steady, his staff in one hand, sling in the other. And in the middle, striding out from the Philistine line, came Goliath, his armor gleaming in the sun, his shadow stretching long across the earth. Each step shook the ground, the iron head of his spear catching the light like fire. His shield-bearer trudged before him, but even that massive shield looked small beside the giant. The distance between them narrowed, one step at a time. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 42, we read, "When the Philistine looked around and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, and ruddy and handsome in appearance." Goliath squinted, his brow furrowed. This was Israel's champion? His booming laugh rang out, echoing across the valley. Verse 43 tells us, "The Philistine said to David, 'Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?' The Philistine cursed David by his gods. His voice thundered with contempt. 'Come here,' he sneered, 'and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field.' His words dripped with arrogance, his threats designed to crush David's spirit. The Philistine ranks roared in approval. Israel's soldiers winced, and Saul, watching from his tent, held his breath. But David did not flinch. His voice, though younger, carried with conviction that silenced the valley. In verses 45 through 47, he answered, "You come to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a javelin. But I come to you in the name of Yahweh of armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. Today, Yahweh will deliver you into my hand. I will strike you down and cut off your head. I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines today to the birds of the sky and to the wild animals of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel. And all this assembly shall know that Yahweh doesn't save with sword and spear, For the battle is Yahweh's, and he will give you into our hand." The boldness of his words struck like a shockwave. David did not boast in himself. He did not lean on his sling or his stones. He placed the entire outcome on the power of God. To Goliath's insults, David offered faith. To his curses, David proclaimed victory. To his threats, David declared the glory of God. The tension broke. Verse 48 says, "When the Philistine arose and came and drew near to meet David, David hurried and ran toward the army to meet the Philistine. Goliath charged, armor clanking, steps pounding like thunder. But David did not retreat. He ran forward, sling in hand. His heart beat steady, not with fear, but with faith. From his bag he pulled a stone, smooth, round, chosen from the brook. With practiced motion, he placed it in his sling. The cords twirled above his head, faster and faster, the air whistling with speed. His eyes locked on the giant's forehead. His arm released. The stone flew, cutting through the air, propelled with deadly precision. Verse 49 declares, "David put his hand in his bag, took a stone, slung it, and struck the Philistine in his forehead. The stone sank into his forehead, and he fell on his face to the earth." Silence. For a heartbeat, time itself seemed to pause. Then, like a tree cut at its base, Goliath crashed forward, face to the ground. Dust rose as his massive frame struck the earth. The valley trembled with the impact. The champion of the Philistines, their terror and pride, was down. But the story was not over. Goliath had fallen, yet the battle still raged. David would soon finish what God had begun. The shepherd boy would show Israel and the nations that God's deliverance is complete. The giant lay still, face down in the dirt. For a long moment, the valley was silent. Dust swirled in the air, carrying the scent of bronze and sweat. The Philistines, who had laughed so loudly, stood frozen, their mouths open but no sound escaping. The Israelites, who had trembled for 40 days, stared in stunned disbelief. The impossible had happened. A shepherd boy with no armor, no sword, no shield, only a sling and a stone, had brought down the champion of Gath. The giant who had defied Israel, who had cursed by his gods, who had mocked the living God, now lay in the dust. But David did not stop. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 50, we read, "So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and struck the Philistine, and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand." Then verse 51 continues, "David ran and stood over the Philistine, and took his sword, and drew it out of its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw that their champion was dead, they fled." Picture the moment. David, small compared to the massive body of Goliath, stood upon him. With effort, he drew the giant's own sword, a weapon so large it must have felt heavy in his grip. And with it, he ended the battle completely, cutting off the head of the one who had defied the armies of God. The victory was not partial, it was total. The Philistines, once bold, now screamed in panic. Their shouts turned to cries of terror as they broke ranks and ran. The army that had mocked Israel now scattered in fear, their courage vanishing with the fall of their champion. The ground shook not with Goliath's steps, but with the stampede of soldiers retreating. Their camp, once filled with laughter, was now a place of chaos. Abandoned weapons clattered to the ground. Shields were dropped, spears left behind, tents deserted in haste. And Israel, the men who had hidden, who had trembled, who had asked one another, "Have you seen this man?" now surged with courage. In verse 52 we read, "The men of Israel and of Judah arose and shouted and pursued the Philistines as far as Gath and the gates of Ekron. The wounded of the Philistines fell down by the way to Shaaraim, even to Gath and to Ekron. The shout that rose from Israel's ridge shook the valley. Their fear was gone. Faith replaced it. They pursued their enemies, driving them back to their own cities. What one boy's faith unleashed could not be contained. David's courage sparked courage in the whole nation. Verse 53 says, "The children of Israel returned from chasing after the Philistines, and they plundered their camp." What had once belonged to the enemy was now in the hands of Israel. Tents, weapons, supplies, all left behind in the rush of fear. God's people not only gained victory, but also blessing from the battle. And in verse 54 we read, "David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem, but he put his armor in his tent." The head of Goliath was displayed as proof that God had delivered Israel, proof that the impossible had happened. The armor of Goliath, a trophy of victory, rested with David. What once intimidated Israel now served as a reminder of God's power. Back in Saul's camp, questions swirled. In verses 55 to 58, Saul asked his commander Abner, "Whose son is this youth?" Though David had served him before, Saul had not fully known him. Abner could not answer, so David was brought before Saul, still holding the head of Goliath in his hand. And Saul asked, "Whose son are you, young man?" David replied, "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." The boy from Bethlehem, the shepherd overlooked by men, had become the hero of Israel. The story of David and Goliath did not end in the valley. It was only the beginning. From this victory, David's path would lead to fame, songs of praise, jealousy from Saul, and eventually the throne of Israel. But the lesson of this moment would echo through history. God delivers not by sword or spear, but by his own power. The sound of victory lingered in the valley of Elah. The echo of Israel's triumphant shouts rolled across the hills long after the Philistines had fled. Dust clouds rose in the distance where the enemy retreated, and the smell of abandoned campfires drifted in the wind. For days, Israel had been frozen in fear. For 40 mornings and evenings, their courage had been crushed by a giant's voice. But now, in a single afternoon, everything had changed. The giant was down. The Philistines were scattered. The valley that had once symbolized terror now stood as a monument of God's deliverance. In the Israelite camp, laughter replaced trembling. Soldiers embraced one another, their fear washed away in the flood of victory. Fathers who had wondered if they would see their children again now shouted songs of praise. Sons who had doubted their strength now raised their swords high. The people knew this was no ordinary triumph. It was not their swords that had won the day, nor their shields, nor their numbers. It was the Lord, working through a shepherd boy. Around campfires that night, men told and retold the story. Did you see how the stone struck him? Did you hear what the boy said about the living God? Did you see the look on the Philistines when he fell? Each man told it with awe, as though he himself had witnessed a miracle. But not all hearts rested easily. King Saul, though relieved at the victory, felt something deeper stirring within him. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, verses 55 through 58, the king asked Abner, "Whose son is this youth?" Strange, isn't it? David had already played music for Saul in his court. He had soothed the king's troubled spirit with his harp. He had been appointed armor-bearer, and yet Saul now asked, "Whose son is he?" Perhaps fear clouded his memory. Perhaps pride refused to acknowledge the boy who had succeeded where he had failed. Perhaps Saul was beginning to sense that this shepherd was more than he appeared, that God's Spirit was with him in a way it no longer rested upon Saul. When David was brought before him, still holding Goliath's severed head, Saul asked again, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David answered humbly, "I am the son of your servant Jesse the Bethlehemite." The answer was simple, but the truth behind it was profound. From Jesse's house in Bethlehem, a new chapter of Israel's story was unfolding. Word of David's victory spread quickly. In villages and towns across Israel, messengers carried the news. The Philistine giant has fallen. A shepherd boy struck him down with a sling and a stone. In homes, mothers told their children of the courage of the boy from Bethlehem. In markets, merchants repeated the story. In the courts of elders, the tale was shared with reverence. David's name was no longer obscure. He had become the symbol of God's deliverance, the hero of Israel, the one who restored hope when all seemed lost. Soon, the women of Israel began to sing. In 1 Samuel chapter 18, verse 7, we later hear their words, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Though this came after more victories, the seed was planted here in the valley." David's triumph over Goliath became the foundation of songs, the kind that children sang in the streets, the kind that echoed in the hearts of the people. It was a celebration of God's power. Yet for Saul, those songs would one day become a thorn of jealousy. This moment was more than military victory. It was a declaration about who truly reigns. The Philistines trusted in their giant. Israel trembled in fear. But God showed that He does not save by sword or spear. His power is not limited by human weakness or enemy strength. David's victory foreshadowed a greater truth, that God chooses the humble, the overlooked, the unexpected, to shame the strong, that He delivers His people not through human might, but through faith. Pause here. David's story reminds us that our greatest victories often begin in our weakest moments. He was young, untrained, underestimated, yet God used him because he trusted fully in Him. What battles lie ahead of you? What giants stand in your path? Remember, you do not fight alone. The same God who delivered David still fights for His people. Take a deep breath. Inhale assurance. Exhale anxiety. Whisper, "The Lord who delivered David will deliver me." From this day forward, David's life would never be the same. His name would spread. His victories would grow. His relationship with Saul would shift from favor to rivalry. And the path to kingship, though long and difficult, had begun. But the lesson of the valley would echo through all of Israel's history and even into ours today. The battle belongs to the Lord. At the heart of the story is David's declaration in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 47. "The battle is Yahweh's, and He will give you into our hand." This is more than a verse. It is the anchor of the whole story. David knew victory did not come from human strength, skill, or weapons. It came from God. Think of it. Saul had armor, swords, spears, and thousands of men, yet none of it moved against Goliath. What won the day was one boy's faith in the Lord. How often do we rely on our armor, our own skills, resources, strategies, forgetting that real victory comes from God alone? David reminds us to lay aside what does not fit and to step forward with what God has already placed in our hands, trusting His strength to do the rest. For 40 days, Goliath's voice filled the valley. Fear silenced Israel. Fear paralyzed Saul. But faith gave David courage. Notice that courage is not the absence of fear. It is faith moving forward despite fear. David must have felt the weight of the moment. He was still young. He was still facing a giant. But his eyes were not fixed on the problem. They were fixed on the Lord. Courage grows when faith is greater than fear. Take a deep breath. Inhale faith. Exhale fear. Whisper, Lord, fix my eyes on you, not on my giants. David's victory was not random. It was the fruit of hidden preparation. Before the valley, there were the pastures. Before Goliath, there were lions and bears. Before the roar of the crowd, there was the quiet song under the stars. God often trains us in private before He uses us in public. The battles no one sees prepare us for the battles everyone will see. The faithfulness we show in small things prepares us for the great things God will call us to. Never despise the hidden seasons. They are God's classroom. When Samuel came to Jesse's house, no one thought of David. His father left him in the fields. His brothers dismissed him. Even Saul doubted him. But God chose him. God saw what others could not, a heart after His own. Perhaps you feel overlooked. Perhaps others dismiss you, underestimate you, or forget you. Take heart. God sees you, and He delights in using the overlooked to accomplish His greatest works. Goliath used words to intimidate. For 40 days he cursed, mocked, and defied. And for 40 days, Israel believed those words. David also used words, words of faith. The Lord will deliver you into my hand. His declaration shifted the atmosphere. His faith-filled words carried more weight than the giant's roar. Words have power. What we speak shapes what we believe. When we declare God's promises, we silence the lies of our giants. The story of David and Goliath is not just ancient history. It is a picture of our lives today. Giants still stand before us, not always 10 feet tall with bronze armor, but in the form of fear, addiction, temptation, despair, illness, or doubt. These giants mock us. They tell us we are too small, too weak, too broken. They rise morning and evening trying to wear us down. But just as God gave David victory, He can give us victory. The giants may look powerful, but they are no match for the living God. David's victory points us to a greater deliverer. Like David, Jesus was underestimated. He came not in royal armor, but in humility. He faced the ultimate giant, sin and death, on our behalf. And with what looked like weakness, He won the greatest victory. The cross was His sling. The stone rolled away was His triumph. Just as David's victory became Israel's victory, Christ's victory becomes ours. As this story draws to a close, let your heart rest in its truth. You do not fight alone. The same God who was with David is with you. The same God who toppled Goliath can topple the giants in your life. Take a long, slow breath. Inhale peace. Exhale worry. Whisper, The battle belongs to the Lord. And so, beloved, we end this night with the story of David and Goliath echoing in our hearts. A shepherd boy faced a giant, not with armor or sword, but with faith. And through him, God showed Israel and us that victory comes from him alone. Amen.